modern sarcasm. Because here's the truth. In the Middle Ages, you didn't date for fun. You didn't date to find yourself. You dated to find a person who wouldn't beat you, steal your goat, or die of consumption before the harvest. If they had land, teeth, and a heartbeat, that was basically a home run. Scene, manor house. A nobleman and noblewoman sit at opposite ends of a massive table. A priest stands awkwardly in between. Now, let's talk about who got to choose love and who didn't. If you were a noble, congratulations. You were fancy, well-fed, and completely screwed in the romance department. Because your marriage, it was arranged before you hit puberty, sometimes before you hit the womb. Your parents picked a spouse based on titles, land, and political leverage, not because they thought you'd vibe with their taste in Gregorian chants. Love? Pfft. Love was for troubadours and poetry. Real nobles married for alliances. You were a pawn on the chessboard of medieval politics, except instead of checkmate, you got a lifetime of polite loathing and joint tax assessments. Voiceover, whispered, conspiratorial tone. But if you were a peasant, things got spicier. Not necessarily more romantic, but definitely more flexible. You didn't have much. A hut, maybe a pig, but you had choices. Not many, but some. You could meet someone at the village well. Maybe you saw them during Lent and thought, wow, she really knows how to fast. Maybe you locked eyes during the Midsummer Festival while stomping on grapes. Love was raw, sweaty, and smelled vaguely of cabbage, but it was yours. Scene, a church service. A boy sneaks glances at a girl while pretending to pray. Where did young people go to flirt? One word, church. Yes, the house of God was also the house of gossip, matchmaking, and furtive glances from behind wooden pews. Everyone was there, and if you sat near someone during Mass 2 Sundays in a row, people started whispering. By the 3rd Sunday, your mother was embroidering towels with their initials. God might have been watching, but so was your entire extended family. Voiceover, dramatic. So, how did you declare your interest? Did you send a letter? No, you were illiterate. Did you send flowers? Possibly if you hadn't already eaten them. Did you make prolonged eye contact while awkwardly walking by? Bingo. Medieval flirting was subtle, mostly because boldness could get you stabbed or excommunicated. A well-timed compliment on someone's oxen. That was peak romance. Scene, village tavern. A woman throws ale in a man's face. He looks thrilled. Of course, you had to be careful. Consent was a fuzzy concept in the Middle Ages. And while the church preached marital fidelity and proper conduct, the reality on the ground was messier than a hog pen during rain. Courtship customs varied by region, class, and whether the local lord was feeling extra tyrannical that year. In some villages, a man might woo a woman by visiting her home at night, which sounds romantic until you realize this often involved knocking on her window and hoping she didn't mistake you for a wolf or a thief. This was called bundling in some areas. And yes, sometimes it involved literally tying the couple together in a bed with a board between them. Just 2 hopeful hearts and a very strict wooden boundary. Voiceover, cynical tone. But even if sparks flew, your relationship didn't move forward until the church said so. You wanted to marry, you needed a priest's blessing. You needed to say your vows in public, ideally during daylight, sober, and with enough witnesses to confirm you weren't marrying your cousin. Again, marriage wasn't just a personal commitment. It was a social contract, a legal agreement, and a theological obligation with consequences. Because once you were married, that was it. No divorce, no we grew apart, just we grew old, bitter, and possibly riddled with fleas. Scene. A medieval couple sits on a haystack, staring blankly into the distance. But here's the surprising bit. Despite all the rules, restrictions, and goat-related dowries, people still fell in love. They still got butterflies. They still took risks. They still held hands behind barns and carved each other's names into tree trunks, or if they couldn't write, they just stabbed the tree and nodded meaningfully. Voiceover, hopeful tone, because even in the mud and the misery, humans stayed human. And love, as it turns out, can survive almost anything, including leprosy, lice, and mandatory chaperones. So next time you complain about modern dating apps, remember, at least you don't have to get your father's permission to hold someone's hand in public while a monk supervises. Coming up in part 2, courtship, where love gets real, chaperones get nosy, and poetry gets dangerously cheesy. Don't miss it. Or Marjorie might marry that guy with the bigger pig. Title: Dating in the Middle Ages, Part 2, Courtship, Chaperones, and Cheese-Based Poetry. Voiceover: upbeat and cheeky, like a modern historical YouTuber with no fear of ruining romance forever. Previously, we explored how medieval dating was basically a cross between a business merger and a livestock auction, with a splash of eye contact at church. But now we enter a more dangerous territory: courtship. Not flirting, not marrying, but that sweet, awkward middle zone where you're not quite lovers, but also definitely not just friends. Welcome to medieval courtship, where every glance is loaded, every touch is scandalous, and every poem could be a felony. Scene: a peasant lad stands outside a cottage, clutching a wilted bouquet and a turnip. He's sweating nervously. Let's say you're a medieval man and you've set your sights on someone special. She's got strong teeth, good birthing hips, and hasn't died of rickets yet. Jackpot. Now what? Do you walk up and ask her out for mead? Do you slide into her parchment scrolls with a "you up" written in Latin? Of course not. You go through her father. Because in the Middle Ages, love didn't begin with chemistry. It began with permission. Voiceover: stern and mock dramatic. Fathers were the ultimate gatekeepers of their daughters' romantic lives. You wanted to talk to her? You asked the dad. You wanted to walk near her? Asked the dad. You wanted to breathe in her general direction? You get the idea. And if her dad said no, well, then you could either challenge him to a duel or go cry into your turnip. Most chose the turnip. Scene: a nobleman and noblewoman sit together awkwardly, while a stern-looking chaperone glares at them from across the room. Now, if you were allowed to court her, that didn't mean candlelit dinners and stolen kisses in moonlight. Nope. It meant supervised visits with a chaperone. Always. Watching. Judging. Think of it like a medieval Netflix date, except instead of chill, you had a nun sitting 6 inches away holding a Bible and a wooden spoon, and no physical contact, not even a casual shoulder bump. Touch was off limits until marriage, or at least until someone accidentally dropped something and brushed hands retrieving it. Scandalous. Voiceover: romantic and mocking. So what did you do during courtship? You talked. A lot. If you were literate, you wrote letters. If you weren't, you had a friend write them, which led to a lot of awkward mistranslations. Nothing like trying to say, "Your eyes are like stars," and ending up with, "Your elbows remind me of boiled eels." You also exchanged tokens, not like arcade coins, but more like trinkets and keepsakes. A ribbon, a scarf, a small cloth with embroidered initials. If you were wealthy, maybe a silver brooch or a comb. If you were poor, a rock with feelings. Scene: a nervous man reading a love poem aloud to a woman who looks both flattered and slightly terrified. And then there was poetry. Oh, the poetry. Courtly love poems were all the rage, especially among nobles, and they followed a strict formula. First, compare the lady to something unreachable. Then, describe your own emotional suffering in excruciating detail. Finally, declare that you will die, spontaneously combust, or wander into the woods forever if she does not love you back. You know, healthy stuff. Example: O fairest maiden, Thy beauty is like a distant swan upon a foggy moat, and I am but a worm writhing in the mud of thy indifference. If thou dost not love me, I shall fling myself into the nearest plague cart. Women either swooned or asked the priest for an exorcism. Voice over, dry and modern, but poetry wasn't always welcome. In fact, in many towns, unapproved courtship could land you in trouble. You think getting ghosted is bad? Try getting fined, shamed, or thrown in the stocks for improper wooing. Seriously, there were laws about this stuff. In some towns, men weren't allowed to serenade women after dark. In others, unmarried couples seen walking alone could be hauled before the church court. You could literally be tried for excessive affection. Apparently, medieval love came with terms and conditions. Scene, peasant girl talking to her friend. Over laundry, both are giggling. And what about the women? Well, they weren't just passive objects of affection. Despite all the rules and restrictions, girls found ways to signal interest. Maybe she gave you an extra piece of bread. Maybe she let her sleeve brush against yours by accident. Maybe she embroidered your name into a handkerchief, then pretended you weren't supposed to see it. Subtle, clever, subversive. Medieval women were basically the masters of slow-burn romance. Because when you can't text someone thinking of you three, you learn to communicate with smirks, glances, and highly strategic bread distribution. Voiceover with a hint of snark. But let's not pretend courtship was always pure. Sometimes it was strategic, sometimes it was transactional, and sometimes it was downright manipulative. There were entire love manuals written by monks and poets that instructed men on how to seduce women, with advice ranging from compliment her fingers to pretend to faint near her garden. Seriously, even back then, pickup artists were a thing. Scene, an older couple bickering as they prepare stew. Eventually, if all went well, and neither of you got plague, excommunicated, or accidentally betrothed to a cousin, courtship would lead to betrothal. This was basically a pre-marriage contract, not just a maybe, a binding agreement. Once you were betrothed, you were expected to marry. Breaking a betrothal was serious business. Like, your families now hate each other, and someone's barn might mysteriously burn down. Serious. Betrothal often came with an exchange of gifts, a formal ceremony, and a lot of parental involvement. It was half romantic and half logistics. Voiceover, warm and reflective. But here's the thing. As strange and regulated as medieval courtship sounds, it still had its magic. Because even with nosy priests, judgmental villagers, and zero privacy, people still found ways to fall in love, to dream, to hope, to write painfully bad poetry that somehow made someone smile. Voiceover, cheeky and fast-paced. So next time you complain about a bad Tinder date, remember, at least no one's dad is demanding a goat in exchange for your hand. At least your crush's aunt isn't hovering over you with a stick during your entire conversation. And at least you can say, "I love you," without worrying about being fined for public emotional disturbance. Medieval dating was weird, wonderful, and wildly dangerous. And in part 3, we'll tackle the grand finale, medieval marriage. Get ready for dowries, child brides, suspicious priests, and why your honeymoon might involve 3 cousins and a dead chicken. Don't miss it. Voiceover, dramatic and amused, like a history teacher who's finally lost patience with romance novels. Our marriage, the sacred union of 2 souls, or, in the Middle Ages, a contractual obligation involving livestock, land disputes, and occasional witch accusations. Welcome to part 3 of our romantic journey through medieval dating, where we finally reach the grand prize, wedding bells, betrothal rings, and the possibility of dying in childbirth before the first anniversary. Let's get hitched. Scene. A noble hall full of serious-looking men poring over documents, while a bride and groom stare blankly into the void. First things first. Medieval marriage wasn't about love. That was a bonus. Like gravy on porridge, unexpected, slightly confusing, often not present. The real goals? Combine wealth, secure alliances, produce heirs who wouldn't immediately die of dysentery. Marriage was a strategic merger, and the bride and groom were often the last to know. Sometimes they didn't even meet until the wedding day. Just imagine, you wake up one morning, and surprise, you're married to Jeffrey, a 14-year-old with a lazy eye and a passion for turnip farming. Voiceover, matter of fact and snarky. And what sealed the deal? The dowry, a delightful tradition where the bride's family pays the groom's family to take her off their hands. Yes, you paid someone to marry your daughter, like a reverse ransom. A good dowry could include money, livestock, land, fine linens, or, if you were really lucky, a goat that didn't bite people. The wealthier the bride's family, the juicier the dowry. If you were poor, well, maybe you offered some chickens and hoped the groom was nearsighted. Scene, a marriage contract being signed by a priest, two serious-looking fathers, and a boy who looks 12. Marriages were often arranged young, sometimes ridiculously. Young girls could be betrothed by age 7, married by 12, and expected to produce heirs by 13. Boys got a little more leeway, mostly because they were still throwing rocks at frogs at that age. But don't worry, many noble marriages weren't consummated until both parties hit puberty, which is, somehow, meant to be reassuring. Consent, optional, parental approval, mandatory, romance, if you were very lucky and the moon was full. Voiceover, with rising sarcasm, the wedding itself, oh, it could be glorious, or incredibly underwhelming. In rural villages, it might just be two people saying vows in front of a priest, one awkward kiss, followed by a communal pig roast and someone passing out in the hay. But among the nobility, you could have a week-long feast, tournaments, 47-course meals, and at least one minstrel singing a ballad about the bride's virtue while everyone pretended she wasn't already pregnant. And remember, if you were a woman, you probably had to wear blue, not white. White didn't symbolize purity yet. That trend shows up centuries later. Blue was the color of the Virgin Mary. Modest, holy, easily stained, perfect for tripping in the mud on your big day. Scene, bride and groom looking exhausted after the ceremony while peasants celebrate wildly. Now we get to the best part, the wedding night, where today you might get champagne, rose petals and privacy. In medieval Europe, you were more likely to get a freezing stone bedroom, 4 watching relatives, a priest muttering blessings in the corner, and someone literally lifting the sheets to confirm consummation. Yes, people actually watched. Why? Because without proof, the marriage was consummated. It could be annulled. Imagine trying to perform under pressure while your Aunt Gertrude knits in the background. Voiceover, disgusted but amused, and let's say you made it through the wedding night. Congratulations. Now comes the married life. What did that look like? For noble women, managing estates, birthing heirs, surviving court gossip, and trying not to get poisoned. For peasant women, cooking, cleaning, endless childbirth, fieldwork, and hoping your husband didn't die in a pig-related accident. For the husbands, farming, war, taxes, possibly syphilis, romantic. Most marriages weren't passionate love stories, they were partnerships of survival, and if you got along, that was a miracle. Like finding a chicken that lays 2 eggs a day, you never questioned it. Voiceover, whispered conspiratorially. Of course, not everyone stayed faithful. Adultery was surprisingly common, especially among the upper class, though it came with wildly different consequences. If a man cheated, scandalous, but manageable. If a woman cheated, hang her, literally. And if you caught your spouse cheating, you could take them to court. Yes, court. There are actual legal records from the 1300s where husbands sued their wives for romantic betrayal and demanded compensation in goats, because nothing says justice like livestock-based vengeance. Scene, priest speaking gravely at a wedding ceremony. But marriage wasn't all doom and gloom. Sometimes Somehow, it worked. 2. People might grow to love each other, or at least tolerate each other, or at least not actively plot each other's deaths, which, by medieval standards, was basically a soulmate situation. There are genuine letters from the Middle Ages where spouses express real affection, concern, and even, dare we say it, love. Sure, they also mention plagues, taxes, and pig thefts, but the heart is there, somewhere, under all the mud. Voiceover, reflective, a little sweet. Medieval marriage was complicated. It wasn't about finding your other half or true love. It was about survival, security, and society. And yet, through all the arranged contracts and forced unions, some people found joy. They made it work. They built families. They laughed together, even if it was over really bad pottage and a shared distrust of the local monk. Voiceover, cheeky outro tone. So, next time someone says modern dating is hard, just remember, at least you didn't have to marry your cousin to secure a cabbage field. At least your honeymoon didn't involve livestock negotiations. And at least no one made you consummate your love while being watched by a village priest and your Uncle Carl. Because in the Middle Ages, love was a battlefield, with ploughs, plague, and the occasional lute solo. Final tease. Thanks for joining us on this romantic misadventure through history. If you thought marriage was wild, wait till you see how they handled divorce. Spoiler, it involved exile, witchcraft, and possibly setting things on fire. That's for next time, if you dare. Opening flourish of lute music. Voiceover begins with a wink. So, you've survived the fleas, the filth, and the overwhelming odor of unwashed humanity long enough to develop a crush on someone. Congratulations, you're now ready for the next perilous step in medieval romance, wooing. And remember, this isn't 21st century Tinder. Swipe right on the wrong noblewoman, and you might find yourself skewered by her father's halberd before you can even say, "My liege." Let's get into it. First impressions. Your social rank is your dating profile in medieval times. Your status was everything. Think of it like a very unforgiving dating app where your profile picture is your family crest and your bio reads something like, "Eighth son of Baron de Crumlingbridge, owns 2 goats and once met a bishop." If you're a peasant, your romantic options are, well, limited. You stick to other peasants. Flirting with a noble's daughter isn't just ambitious, it's suicidal. Nobles, on the other hand, might pursue grand romances, but their marriages are usually arranged, which means real wooing often happens after you're already stuck with your betrothed. More on that in part 5, Surviving Medieval Marriage Without Dying of Ennui. Flirting, Medieval Edition, forget cheesy pickup lines. In the Middle Ages, flirting was a delicate art involving courtly gestures, elaborate etiquette, and lots of intense, unblinking eye contact. The ideal method, courtly love, a concept popularized by troubadours, poets, and the occasional lovesick knight with too much time on his hands. Courtly love was all about yearning, suffering, and writing long poems about how beautiful your lady's elbow is. It was a game of noble restraint and exaggerated manners. For example, do, bow deeply, speak in verse, and compliment her virtues as though she were the Virgin Mary reincarnated. Don't mention her ankles, breathe too loudly, or be visibly excited. That's how you get flogged for indecency. And if you're a lady looking to drop hints, a well-timed handkerchief drop could send a man into a spiral of emotional turmoil, lasting several months. Powerful stuff. Love letters and lute songs, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, you probably aren't unless you're a monk or aristocrat. You might pen a love letter. These letters are full of metaphor, chivalric references, and flowery nonsense. Example, my most radiant star, whose light outshines the moon, and whose voice hath greater sweetness than a nightingale in spring. Translation, hey, you're cute. If you can't write, no worries. That's where the troubadours come in. Medieval musical mercenaries who'll compose a song for a small fee, or just for a mug of ale and an appreciative nod. Though be warned, serenading a noblewoman outside her window could be romantic, or grounds for execution depending on her father's mood. Gift giving. Please your lady with a dead falcon. No medieval romance is complete without the proper gifts. Forget roses and chocolate. In the Middle Ages, nothing says I adore you quite like a falcon, a chunk of amber, or a tapestry featuring your beloved's face, ideally with fewer warts than in real life. For peasants, gifts were simpler. Maybe a wooden comb, a sprig of rosemary, or the ultimate gesture of devotion, offering your last chunk of black bread. Of course, everything depended on intention. Give a married woman a gift, and you might be accused of enticement, a serious offense. Give a nun a gift, and congratulations, you're now excommunicated. Obstacles to wooing. The church, the Inquisition, and probably her brothers, you'd think love would conquer all. But in medieval Europe, love often lost to the church, which frowned upon anything remotely fun. They considered desire a sin unless it was aimed exclusively at your legally wedded spouse in a procreation-only context. No smiling. Chaperones, who followed noblewomen everywhere. These were often stern old aunts with eyes like hawks and zero tolerance for flirtation. Think, human chastity belts, jealous suitors, who might challenge you to a duel over a sideways glance. If you're not good with a sword, best practice your poetry and pray he's sentimental. When things get steamy, secret trysts and potential jail time. If your courtship goes well, it might lead to secret meetings. These often took place in gardens, churches, or random corners of drafty castles. But beware, the line between romantic and immoral was razor thin. For nobles, secret love affairs were common, but discretion was key. For peasants, public opinion did the job of reputation enforcement. Gossip travelled faster than the plague, and nothing ruins a budding romance faster than your lover being shamed by the local priest mid-sermon. And if the affair is discovered, penalties ranged from shunning to flogging to, yes, actual imprisonment. Truly, nothing says I love you like risking eternal damnation and a week in the pillory. Final tip, woo with honour, or not at all above all, the key to medieval wooing was honour. Whether you were a knight pledging fealty to a married duchess or a miller trying to charm the blacksmith's daughter, the rules of romance required restraint, poetry, and ideally, no bodily contact whatsoever. So the next time you feel frustrated with modern dating apps, just remember, at least no one's trying to stab you with a lance for saying hello. So, you've managed to find love in the Middle Ages. You dodged the church's judgment, avoided marrying your cousin, barely, and your parents didn't barter you for 12 sheep and a half-dead goat. Congratulations, you're now in a committed relationship, which means now the real drama begins. Welcome to the delightfully unhinged world of medieval jealousy, sketchy love spells, and matchmaking methods that make modern dating apps look like clinical science. In this chapter of medieval romance, we dive into what happened after the initial courtship, and it's equal parts hilarious, tragic, and completely bonkers. Let's start with jealousy, a feeling that burned just as hot in the 12th century as it does today. Only in the Middle Ages, people didn't deal with it by texting passive-aggressive emojis or rage-watching their ex's Instagram story. No, they did things the medieval way, with curses, charms, and occasionally, a shovel. In noble courts, jealousy could cause serious political fallout. A wayward glance from a duchess, a knight's attention lingered too long, and suddenly you've got duels being fought in the forest over who touched whose elbow. Meanwhile, among peasants, jealousy was less about honour and more about property. If your wife ran off with the blacksmith, you didn't just lose her, you probably lost your ploughshares too. And when jealousy struck, people turned to interesting solutions. Enter the love potion. Ah yes, the magical elixir of eternal affection. Just one sip, and your beloved would be yours forever, or at least until the potion wore off, or they died from food poisoning. Because, let's be honest, medieval science was mostly just herbs, superstition, and wild experimentation. Common ingredients included mandrake root, believed to arouse passion, but also potentially cause hallucinations or death. Minor side effects: henbane, mildly narcotic and extremely toxic. Nothing says true love like seizures. Rosemary and wine, the medieval equivalent of a romantic dinner and drinks, and, disturbingly often, urine. Yes, you read that correctly. One of the most effective love spells, according to 14th century folk magic, involved the would-be lover drinking the urine of the object of their affection. "She'll never notice," said no modern Tinder user ever, but it gets better, or worse, depending on your tolerance for medieval weirdness. There were charms to keep a partner faithful. These could be sewn into clothes, burned under beds, or whispered at midnight while holding a clump of your lover's hair. That's right, medieval dating had full-blown witchy vibes, and if all else failed, people turned to magic mirrors, love knots, or professional cunning folk, sort of like medieval relationship coaches, except with more goat blood and fewer TED Talks. But while folk remedies offered questionable results, there were more institutional matchmaking methods, some of which were, well, let's just say they get a dating app banned from every app store today. Take trial marriages. In some parts of medieval Europe, couples could live together for a trial year to see if they were compatible. If it worked out, congrats, you're married. If it didn't, pack your thatch and move on. This practice was frowned upon by the church, of course, but remained popular in more rural areas where priests were few and far between. Then there was the bed test, a truly medieval twist on reality TV. In legal disputes over marriage consummation or fidelity, courts would literally send officials to watch a couple in bed, not in action, thank heavens, but to confirm they shared a bed overnight and were acting like a real couple. You thought in-laws were intrusive, but the crown jewel of medieval matchmaking had to be love divination. These were little rituals designed to divine the identity of your future spouse. Common techniques included eating a salted herring before bed to dream of your future love, not recommended for those sensitive to sodium or fishy dreams. Placing a piece of wedding cake under your pillow, if only cake existed outside of noble courts. Gazing into a bowl of water by candlelight to see the face of your beloved. Also, a great way to summon a demon. 2 birds, 1 stone. And let's not forget the apple peel test, where you'd peel an apple in one long strip and toss the peel over your shoulder. Supposedly, it would form the shape of your future spouse's initials. More likely, it just looked like a sad worm on the floor. But hey, it was something to do. Of course, love in the Middle Ages wasn't always about charms and tricks. Sometimes you got lucky. You found someone who actually liked you back, didn't die of the plague, and shared your enthusiasm for goats. That, in itself, was a miracle. But if your love story took a darker turn, say, your partner fell for someone else, or your betrothal collapsed over dowry disputes, things could spiral fast. Because for all the charm of medieval romance, it could be brutally unforgiving. Women who lost their reputations over love could find themselves cast out or forced into convents. Men who loved beneath their station risked ridicule, or worse, exile. And if you happened to fall for someone really off limits, like a nun, a priest, or the king's mistress, well, hope you enjoyed your freedom. So, was love worth it? Apparently so. Because even in a time when diseases were rampant, life was short and matchmaking involved sheep, people still risked everything for a chance at love. They drank potions, cast charms, defied families, and faced the wrath of God, just for a stolen kiss, a shared glance, or a whispered promise. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful, and slightly deranged, but mostly beautiful. Congratulations, you've tied the knot. The banns were read, the feast was thrown, someone got drunk and fell into the well. It was a beautiful ceremony. You and your new spouse are now officially man and wife, or wife and man, or possibly man and man, but you'll need to keep that very quiet or risk being publicly flayed. Either way, you're married. So, now what? Well, buckle up, because medieval marriage wasn't a Disney ending. It was the start of a legally binding, often brutally practical partnership full of manure, children, and the ongoing mystery of where the good spoons keep disappearing, too. Let's start with living arrangements. If you were a peasant, which most people were, your new home was probably a small one-room cottage with a thatched roof, a dirt floor, and one bed, if you were lucky. This bed was shared by you, your spouse, your children, and maybe a goat, because goats were warm and heating was expensive. There was no such thing as privacy. Your new spouse would see everything: your morning breath, your chamber pot habits, your method of picking lice out of your hair. The honeymoon phase didn't last long when your first task as a couple was scraping dung off the walls. If you were noble, of course, things looked different. You might get your own solar, a fancy word for a room with windows, or at least a feather mattress and a private corner for squabbling in hushed, aristocratic tones. But even then, marriage was more about alliances and property than mutual affection. Love was optional, land was not. Now let's talk about gender roles. Because medieval marriage came with very clear expectations. A man was supposed to rule the household, he worked the fields, or managed the estate, made financial decisions, and had legal authority over his wife. Meanwhile, a wife was expected to bear children, cook food, spin wool, brew ale, tend to animals, and somehow not die from exhaustion, childbirth, or a poorly aimed chamber pot. Wives were basically the Swiss Army knives of the household. They were healers, weavers, bakers, midwives, accountants, and occasionally bouncers when the neighbour tried to steal your firewood. And children? Oh, there would be children, lots of them, partly because of religious pressure, partly because there wasn't much else to do after dark, and partly because half your kids were likely to die before age 5. Brutal, yes, but common. A strong marriage was often measured by how many surviving heirs you could produce before the age of 35. But it wasn't all doom, gloom, and diaperless toddlers. There were tender moments. Couples held hands at the May Fair, exchanged small tokens of affection, and sometimes even, gasp, enjoyed each other's company. Love could grow over time, especially if both partners were kind, hard-working, and agreed that the neighbour's rooster was an unholy menace. Still, tensions were inevitable. Medieval marriages had no therapists, no couples retreats, and no Netflix and chill. Disagreements were settled with shouting, sulking, or, in extreme cases, actual public marital duels. Yes, these were real. In 15th century Germany, for example, a husband and wife could settle disputes with a legally sanctioned fight. The man had to stand in a hole with one hand tied behind his back, while the woman got a sack of rocks, very progressive. Also, extremely dangerous. Of course, most disagreements were settled the usual way: passive aggression and pointed prayers. But let's not forget the role of religion in all this. The church believed marriage was sacred, permanent, and very serious. It frowned upon divorce, remarriage, and especially fun. Sex was tolerated, but only within marriage, only for procreation, and ideally without anyone smiling. Too much affection could be seen as sinful. Too little could be grounds for annulment. You had to walk a very narrow path between holy matrimony and heresy, and hope your spouse didn't confess anything too exciting during Lent. Now, if you were lucky enough to be in a marriage based on mutual respect, maybe even affection, you might have found a real partnership. Husbands and wives often worked side by side, shared jokes, sang songs, and built something lasting. There were no anniversaries, unless you counted the annual pig slaughter. But there was loyalty, there was endurance, and when your spouse died, which, given the average life expectancy, was not far off, you might even remarry. Sometimes out of grief, sometimes for survival, occasionally because the neighbour finally divorced that terrible rooster. So, was medieval married life romantic? Not exactly, but it could be intimate. It could be meaningful, It was a lifelong act of teamwork, often forged in mud, manure, and shared misfortune. And if you made it through the winters, the plagues, and the tax collectors together, well, that was as close to happily ever after as the Middle Ages got. So, things didn't work out. Maybe your spouse snores like a warhorse with a head cold. Maybe they've run off with the miller's daughter. Or maybe you just realized that being legally bound to someone who bathes once a season isn't all it's cracked up to be. In the 21st century, you'd get a divorce lawyer and half the house. In the Middle Ages, you'd get a long chat with a priest, a load of shame, and, if you were very, very unlucky, a death sentence. Let's talk medieval breakups. First of all, divorce, as we think of it today, was nearly impossible. The medieval church didn't do divorce. Once you were married, that was it. One man, one woman, one God, and a lifetime of regretting your decisions. Marriage was a sacrament like baptism or communion. You couldn't just undo it because you got bored or because your spouse kept feeding the good apples to the pigs. So how did people escape bad marriages? Enter the concept of the annulment. An annulment declared that a marriage had never been valid to begin with. It was basically the church's way of saying, oops, we take it back. That one doesn't count. To get an annulment, you needed a solid excuse. And by solid, we mean deeply technical and ideally supported by witnesses. Here were some of the church-approved reasons. Consanguinity. You were too closely related. A real risk when everyone in your village shared 2 surnames. Pre-contract. One of you was already promised to someone else. Impotence. If a husband physically couldn't consummate the marriage, and it had to be permanent, not just a bad night. Fraud or coercion. One of you was tricked or forced into the marriage. Hello, drunk wedding at harvest festival. Clerical. Error. The marriage wasn't properly performed or recorded. What you couldn't say was, we just don't love each other anymore. The church didn't care. That was your problem. And even if your annulment was granted, it came with a side of scandal, social stigma, and legal mess. If land or inheritance was involved, forget it. Annulments could drag on for years, especially if you were nobility and the Pope himself had to weigh in. But let's say you didn't want to wait for Rome. What about adultery? Well, adultery was a recognized cause for marital drama, but rarely grounds for separation. If your husband was cheating, tough luck. If you were cheating, also tough luck, but with added chances of public shaming, corporal punishment, or death, especially if you were a woman. Adulterous women could face fines, whippings, imprisonment, branding, or, in particularly harsh jurisdictions, execution. For noble women, adultery was also political dynamite. If you gave birth to a child, that wasn't your husband's. It could throw entire dynasties into chaos. Royal bastards had a nasty habit of causing wars. Still, infidelity happened. A lot. Medieval towns had brothels. Travelling clergy weren't always celibate. And visiting the farrier sometimes meant more than shoeing your horse. But while men's dalliances were often tolerated, women were held to much stricter standards. Because, as we've established, hypocrisy is timeless. Now, let's say things got really bad. Enter separation from bed and board, the medieval version of sleeping on the couch for eternity. The church allowed legal separation in cases of abuse, neglect, or danger, but you still couldn't remarry. You were just married but alone, for life. There were also informal solutions. In towns and villages, people found creative ways to part ways without involving the church. Maybe one spouse just disappeared. Maybe both quietly moved on. Maybe they lived together but led completely separate lives, like roommates who also hate each other's guts. Some people entered monasteries to escape their marriages. Others faked deaths, vanished into the woods, or joined crusades. Nothing says, I'm over this relationship, like picking up a sword and heading to the Holy Land. But in some dramatic cases, especially in the noble courts, breakups made headlines. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Louis VII. They got an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, too closely related, even though they'd been married for 15 years and had 2 daughters. Within weeks, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King of England and helped launch an empire. Now that's a rebound. Or how about Henry VIII, who went through 6 wives trying to get a male heir? His first divorce triggered the English Reformation. His second ended in beheading. His third finally gave him a son, who died young. Henry eventually died bloated, paranoid, and probably covered in gout. Moral of the story: don't be Henry VIII. So, to recap, medieval. Marriage was hard to get out of. Adultery was dangerous. Annulments were political. And your best breakup strategy might have been joining a convent and pretending you never liked sex to begin with. But hey, at least there were no divorce lawyers charging $400 an hour, just monks, parchment, and the occasional flaming stake. So, you want to attract a mate in the Middle Ages? Forget modern dating apps and Tinder swipes. Here, it's all about how you look, how you smell, and how well you can strut your stuff in public without fainting from bad air. Welcome to the world of medieval beauty, fashion, and grooming, where the rules are very different and sometimes downright bizarre. First up, fashion. If you were a noble, your clothes screamed status louder than a town crier on market day. Colours mattered. Bright reds, blues, and purples were the in colours because the dyes were expensive and hard to get. The deeper the colour, the richer you looked. Layers, layers, layers. Multiple tunics, surcoats, cloaks, and sometimes fur-lined garments made you look like a walking pile of wealth. Bonus points if you had embroidery or jewels sewn in. Pointy shoes, or poulaines, were a style statement. The longer the point, the flashier the shoe. At their peak, some points were so long they had to be tied to the leg so they wouldn't trip you up. But if you were a commoner, well, you got what you got. Usually coarse wool or linen dyed in dull browns, greys or greens, worn until they nearly fell apart. Now, beauty standards. And yes, they were very specific. Pale skin was the ultimate goal. Why? Because it meant you didn't have to work outside all day. Farmers and labourers were tanned from sun exposure, so a pale face said, "I'm rich enough to lounge indoors." To achieve that look, medieval women, and some men, went to extreme lengths. They avoided the sun like it was a plague. They used lead-based white makeup to lighten their skin, which, spoiler alert, was toxic and could cause serious health problems. Some even plucked their hairlines to create a higher forehead, which was considered a sign of intelligence and nobility. Yep, bald was beautiful. Eyebrows, thin or almost non-existent, were in vogue. Thick brows were thought of as unruly and unfashionable. What about hair? Women's hairstyles varied by region and status. Married women often wore veils or wimples, those neat cloth wraps that covered the head and neck, symbolizing modesty and piety. Unmarried women could wear their hair loose, sometimes braided or curled. Men kept their hair at various lengths, but very long hair was associated with knights and nobility. Hygiene. That's a complicated one. Despite the myths about medieval filth, people did bathe, just not as often as we do today. Baths were usually seasonal, and a full body wash might happen only a few times a year. To mask odours, people used herbs and flowers. Lavender, rosemary, and rose petals were popular. Pomanders, little balls filled with fragrant spices that nobles would carry or wear to keep the smell of the city or their less than fresh neighbours at bay. Perfumed gloves and powders. The aristocracy loved their scents and would layer them on generously. And now, the art of seduction. In a world with strict social rules, public displays of affection were rare and scandalous. So how did you show interest? Gifts. A knight might present a lady with a token, like a scarf, a ring, or even a lock of hair. Poetry and songs. Troubadours and minstrels performed love ballads, often extolling the beauty of noble ladies. Courtly love rituals. These were highly codified, with knights dedicating their feats and victories to their chosen lady. even if she was married to someone else. Unrequited love was a common medieval theme. Subtle gestures. Holding a lady's glove or a meaningful glance could speak volumes. Remember, real marriages were usually arranged for political or economic reasons, so romantic love was often kept separate or even secret from the marriage itself. Courtly love was more about admiration and idealization than actual physical relationships. Quick fun fact: men sometimes powdered their faces too, and elaborate hats were a must-have accessory. Hats could be huge and wildly shaped. Imagine a giant funnel or a bird's nest perched on your head. The bigger the hat, the more attention you got. So, if you want to find love in the Middle Ages, you better start practicing your curtsies, perfect your pale complexion, and learn a few love poems by heart. Next time on Dating in the Middle Ages. Part 9, we'll dive into weddings and wedding traditions, from the lavish ceremonies of the aristocracy to the simple, raucous celebrations of the peasants. So, you've wooed your intended, mastered the art of courtly love, and now it's time for the big moment, the wedding. But don't expect a quick civil ceremony with a slice of cake and a dance floor. Medieval weddings were a whole different story, a mix of religious ritual, social contract, and a wild party that could last for days. Let's break down what a medieval wedding really looked like, from the sacred to the ridiculous. First things first, the betrothal marriage didn't just happen on a whim. Usually, there was a betrothal or engagement period, sometimes arranged by families long before the couple ever met. Betrothal was legally binding, a contract where families negotiated dowries, land, and alliances. Breaking a betrothal wasn't just awkward, it could lead to serious consequences, including fines or social disgrace. The wedding ceremony. Most medieval weddings were religious ceremonies held in a church, overseen by a priest. The heart of the ceremony was the exchange of vows and rings. In some cases, the groom would publicly declare the marriage in front of witnesses and the community, kind of like a medieval I do. The church insisted on consent from both parties. But in practice, many brides had little say, especially in noble families. Blessings were given, prayers were said, and sometimes holy relics were displayed to sanctify the union. Dress code, oh yes. Brides in noble circles wore their best gowns, usually bright colors and heavy with embroidery, jewels, and fur. White wedding dresses? Not a thing yet. White symbolized purity, but wasn't a standard bridal color until much later. Veils were common, symbolizing modesty and chastity. Grooms wore their finest clothes, often matching the bride's colors to show unity. The feast and celebration. Now comes the part everyone loved, the wedding feast. Feasts could last several days, depending on wealth and status. Food was abundant. Roasted, meats, pies, breads, cheeses, and lots of ale or wine. Entertainment included minstrels, jesters, dancing, and sometimes even mock battles or tournaments for the knights. Commoner weddings, less formal, more fun for peasants and townsfolk. Weddings were simpler but no less joyful. They often took place at home or in the village church. The whole community pitched in with food, drink, and music. Dancing and singing went late into the night. Sometimes, the groom would have to win the bride by completing tasks or paying a bride price. The darker side, marriage as a political tool. Especially among the nobility, marriage was a strategic alliance. Marriages sealed peace treaties, combined lands, and strengthened family power. Love was often secondary, and many couples lived separate lives or in unhappy unions. Divorce was rare and difficult, usually requiring a special church dispensation. After the wedding. The honeymoon? The concept of a honeymoon existed but looked different. Couples might retreat to a private chamber or countryside estate. This time was often used to consummate the marriage, an important legal step to validate the union. For nobles, this period could be quite formalized, with family members nearby to supervise. So, medieval weddings were a big deal, a mix of faith, family politics, and festival. They were about uniting more than just two people. They united families, villages, and sometimes even kingdoms. Next time on Dating in the Middle Ages, Part 10, we'll explore what happened after the wedding, medieval married life, the challenges couples faced, and how love, or the lack of it, played out behind closed doors. All right, you've survived the whirlwind wedding celebration, and now you're officially hitched, medieval style. But what did married life actually look like back then? Was it all romance and happiness, or more of a grind filled with hard work, social rules, and occasional drama? Spoiler alert, it's complicated. The daily grind. Marriage was a partnership, mostly about survival. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just about love or companionship, it was an economic and social contract. For peasants and common folk, marriage meant teamwork. Husbands and wives shared the daily labor of farming, cooking, child-rearing, and managing the household. For nobles, it meant managing estates, political alliances, and heirs. The wife often took charge of the household staff, finances, and sometimes even estates when her husband was away. Love was sometimes part of the equation, but often secondary to survival and social status. The love part, did it exist? Romantic love, as we think of it today, wasn't always the main reason for marriage. The idea of courtly love, idealized, often secret, and sometimes unrequited, was more common outside marriage. Married couples sometimes grew to love each other, but many marriages were arranged with little emotional foundation. Letters and poetry show that some medieval couples deeply cared for one another, but plenty lived in pragmatic partnerships. The role of women, limited but crucial. Women's roles were shaped by strict social and religious expectations. Wives were expected to be obedient, faithful, and manage the household. Noble women could wield power behind the scenes, especially as widows or regents. But everyday women had fewer rights. Education for women was limited, often focusing on religion, domestic skills, and occasionally some literacy. Children and inheritance. Having children, especially sons, was crucial. Producing heirs was a primary goal, especially for nobles. High infant mortality meant many families lost several children before one survived. Inheritance laws, like primogeniture, meant the eldest son usually got the family land and title, leaving other siblings to find their own way. Conflict and divorce marriages could be rocky. Domestic disputes were common, but public knowledge was limited. Church courts handled many marital issues. Divorce was rare and difficult. Annulments required proving the marriage was invalid, such as lack of consent or consanguinity, being too closely related. Abandonment, adultery, and abuse were grounds for church intervention, but outcomes varied widely. Social life and community married couples were at the heart of village or court life. They participated in religious festivals, markets, and social events. Family alliances were maintained through visits, gifts, and communal obligations. The community kept an eye on marriages, ensuring social norms were followed. The shadow of death, widowhood, and remarriage. Death was a constant reality. Widows and widowers had more freedom, but also faced economic uncertainty. Remarriage was common and often necessary for survival, especially for women without property. Widows sometimes managed estates or businesses, gaining a level of independence rare for medieval women. So, medieval married life was a mix of hard work, social expectation, and the occasional spark of romance. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding we might imagine, but for many, it was a partnership that helped them survive and thrive in a tough world. Next time on Dating in the Middle Ages, Part 11, we'll dive into the sometimes wild and often hilarious world of medieval festivals, courting rituals, and the quirky customs that surrounded love and marriage. Welcome to the grand finale. We've traveled through courtships, weddings, and married life. Now let's end on a high note by exploring the lively, sometimes downright strange festivals and customs where medieval people actually flirted and fell in love. Plus, I'll share some final thoughts on what medieval dating really means to us today. Festivals, the original dating apps. Medieval festivals were the social hubs where people from all walks of life came together. Think of them as the bustling town squares with music, dancing, food, and more than a little eye contact. May Day celebrations were huge, with dancing around the maypole, singing, and sometimes playful courtship rituals. Mummers' plays and mystery plays were not just entertainment. They were occasions for people to gather and mingle. Harvest festivals and fairs gave peasants a rare break from work, with plenty of chances for teasing, jesting, and flirting. Nobles had their own extravagant banquets and balls, where politicking and matchmaking often happened under the guise of entertainment. Quirky courting customs, courtship in medieval times could be both charming and bizarre. Love tokens like gloves, rings, or handkerchiefs were given to show affection, though giving a glove sometimes meant challenging someone to a duel. Poetry and songs were common ways to express feelings, especially in noble circles influenced by troubadours. Trial marriages, or periods of living together before official marriage, happened occasionally, though frowned upon by the church. Public teasing and playful challenges were common ways for couples to test compatibility. The church and love, friends or foes. The church wielded massive power over marriage and sex, but that didn't stop people from loving, flirting, and yes, sometimes rebelling. Clergy preached chastity and obedience, but also promoted the sanctity of marriage. Saints, stories and religious dramas often highlighted love and sacrifice, shaping ideals of devotion. Confession and penance were parts of the romantic dance. People confessed sins of love and lust, then tried again. Final thoughts. What medieval dating teaches us. Looking back, medieval dating wasn't a simple story of oppression or romantic bliss. It was full of complexities, just like today. People sought connection and companionship, navigating social rules and personal desires. Despite limited rights and harsh realities, love, humor, and human spirit found ways to shine. Many modern traditions, from weddings to love letters, trace their roots back to this fascinating era. And that's a wrap on dating in the Middle Ages. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the quirks, challenges, and charm of medieval romance. Whether you're a history buff or just here for the stories, remember, love in any era is messy, unpredictable, and utterly human. If you want, I can help you create more deep dives or fun series on other historical topics. Just say the word,